At the edge of Bellewood, where the village paths turned to grassy lanes and the sea air carried the scent of salt and clover, stood a house that seemed to grow out of the hill itself. It wasn't large, nor particularly grand, but the garden that surrounded it was a tangle of wonder, foxgloves and ferns spilling over low stone walls, trailing vines of honeysuckle twining around the porch, and rare blossoms that no one in Bellewood could name, plants Samuel Blossom had gathered on his travels and coaxed into bloom here. Inside, the house smelled faintly of pressed flowers, old books, and the beeswax polish he used on his wooden writing desk. Samuel sat at that desk now, sketching. The page before him held the beginnings of a wild orchid, delicate petals shaded with the faintest blush of mauve, its slender stem curling with quiet strength. Samuel Blossom had always loved plants. As a boy, he spent hours wandering Bellewood's fields with a battered notebook, pressing wildflowers between the pages, scribbling notes about their scents, shapes, and hidden uses. His mother, long gone now, used to shake her head fondly at his dirty boots and stained fingertips. "Samuel, you're more patient for petals than people," she once teased. It was true. At 30, he had never married, not because he didn't value companionship, but because his work had consumed him. Years of study in London's botanical gardens, expeditions to far-off hillsides in France and Italy, months aboard ships crossing restless seas, carrying home seed packets wrapped carefully in waxed paper. He had loved it all, but he had grown weary of foreign ports and noisy cities. When he returned to Bellewood in late spring, the village felt different somehow, not changed, but as though it had been waiting for him. The apothecary window glowed warmly in the square each evening, and he noted with quiet curiosity that it wasn't Aunt Martha tending the shop anymore. He hadn't yet stopped in to introduce himself, but there was time for that. His house on a hill was enough for now. The garden needed his hands again after months away, and the bees he kept in a row of tidy hives buzzed around him as he worked. In the evenings, Samuel took long walks along the cliffs. He liked the hush of Bellewood after sundown, the faint music of the waves against the rocks, the lanterns glowing in the square below. And though he'd never admit it out loud, there was a restlessness in his chest that all these travels hadn't soothed. He had sketched hundreds of flowers, cataloged dozens of rare herbs, and learned the names of plants in 6 languages, but lately he found himself wondering, what good are all these notes and sketches if there's no one to share them with? That night, Samuel lit the oil lamp in his study and opened a fresh page in his journal. At the top he wrote, "Observations from the garden, July 15." But his pen hovered over the paper for a long moment. Instead of listing botanical details, he found himself writing, "The air carries lavender tonight from the apothecary in the square. I've yet to meet the new keeper. She keeps a steady light in the window." In the quiet of his house, surrounded by books and flowers, Samuel Blossom exhaled slowly. He didn't know it yet, but Bellewood and the woman in the apothecary were about to change his life. The morning air was warm and heavy with the scent of wild roses as Meg stepped through the apothecary's back door. In her hand she carried a small basket lined with linen. Inside were sprigs of rosemary and lavender she'd cut from the garden earlier, their fragrance mingling with the faint sweetness of drying mint. She followed the narrow path that curved along the edge of the meadow, the hem of her dress brushing the tall grasses as she walked. It wasn't often she left the shop this time of day. There was always something to dust, jars to restock, salves to blend, but Eliza Merrick had insisted she take the morning for herself. "Go breathe the sea air," Eliza had said. "You've earned it." And though Meg had hesitated, she found herself grateful now for the space. The path dipped gently toward the cliffs. Meg paused for a moment, lifting her face to the soft breeze drifting in from the ocean. It smelled of salt and sun-warmed stone. Somewhere nearby, bees droned lazily among the clover. She nearly didn't see him at first. A tall man knelt just off the path, a leather satchel opened at his side, his hands cupping a slender wildflower as though it were made of glass. He had a sketchbook propped on his knee, the page already half filled with delicate lines tracing the flower's shape. Meg hesitated, unsure whether to interrupt, but as she stepped forward, her foot caught a loose stone and sent it skittering across the path. The man looked up. For a moment, neither spoke. Meg noticed the sun catching in his hair, dark with the faintest thread of copper in the light, and the steady calm in his gray-green eyes. "Good morning," he said at last, rising smoothly to his feet. "Good morning," Meg replied, adjusting her grip on the basket. "You must be the new apothecary," he said. His voice was warm but unhurried, like someone accustomed to long silences and the weight of his own thoughts. Meg gave a faint nod. "I am." "Margaret Hale. Most call me Meg." "Samuel Blossom," he said, inclining his head. "The botanist, though I suppose I've been away too long to still claim that title here." She tilted her head slightly. "You've been traveling?" "Yes, Italy, France, a bit of the southern coast." He glanced down at the flowers still in his hand. "Sketching, collecting seeds, trying to see what might grow in Bellewood soil." There was a pause, not awkward, but soft, like the hush before bees return to a blossom. "And how do you find Bellewood soil?" Meg asked. A faint smile touched his lips. "Stubborn in some places, generous in others. Much like the people, I suspect." She laughed quietly, surprising herself. "I can't argue with that." He glanced at the basket in her hands. "Lavender and rosemary." "Yes, for tinctures and sachets, although I'm still learning." "You seem steady enough," Samuel said gently. "I noticed your window light the other evening. It was comforting, in its way." Meg felt a small, unexpected warmth in her chest. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." A gull cried overhead, and a fresh breeze stirred the grasses. Samuel tucked his pencil into the leather strap of his satchel. "I'll leave you to your work, Miss Hale." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "I hope our paths cross again." "So do I," Meg said, her voice quieter than she intended. And as she watched him stride up the hill, his satchel swinging gently at his side, Meg felt the faintest flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't grief, and it wasn't guilt. It was possibility. That evening, as she lit the candle in the apothecary's window, she whispered softly, "Maybe the world isn't done with me yet." The sketchbook lay open in Samuel's eyes, a delicate wildflower, traced in precise lines across the page, but his pencil hovered, unmoving. For once, he wasn't thinking about the flower. He had spent the afternoon cataloging specimens from his trip, tiny packets of seeds wrapped in wax paper, pressed petals from hillsides in Liguria, a few sketches of alpine herbs from the Pyrenees. He thought Bellewood would feel small after such travels, but instead it felt expansive in a different way. And then there was her, Meg Hale. He hadn't expected anyone to be walking the cliff path that morning, but he had noticed her instantly, her slender figure, the way she carried the basket gently but firmly as though it held something precious, chestnut hair pulled back in a ribbon, a faint smudge of soil on one wrist. She moved carefully, not timidly, but with the kind of attention he understood, a woman learning how to exist in her own quiet rhythm. She hadn't recognized his name. He liked that. Too often, in his earlier years, introductions had been laced with assumptions. A botanist must be eccentric. A traveler must be unreliable. But she had looked at him plainly, without judgment. And her voice? There had been something in it. Soft, yes, but steady underneath, like water flowing beneath ice. Samuel leaned back in his chair and closed the sketchbook. It had been years since he thought seriously of sharing his life with someone. Botany had consumed him. Seasons spent in greenhouses and fields, late nights poring over taxonomies, weeks at sea cataloging new seeds. It wasn't that he had avoided marriage, but he had never met a woman whose presence felt settling until now. He rose and moved to the window. From this high on the hill, he could see the faint glow of a candle in the apothecary's window down in the square. She was there then, likely tending her jars, or perhaps sitting by the fire with a book on her lap. He found himself hoping their paths would cross again, not out of urgency, but because there was a stillness in her that felt rare, like a garden left untended for too long, just beginning to bloom again. Samuel rubbed a smudge of graphite from his thumb and murmured softly to the empty room, "Miss Hale, I wonder what you'll grow here." That night, he sketched not a flower, but the faint outline of a woman with a basket of herbs in her arms, the sea breeze lifting her ribbon-tied hair. The rosemary had grown wild near the apothecary fence. Meg knelt in the soft earth, her fingers stained green as she trimmed sprigs of the sprawling bush. Bees hovered lazily over the lavender rose, their low hum blending with the rustle of leaves in the warm breeze. It had been a long, steady day in the shop. Mrs. Renshaw had lingered for an hour chatting about her eldest son, and Tom Fletcher had stopped by for more comfy salve, his booming laughter filling the air as he left. Now, in the late afternoon light, Meg felt the quiet settle around her like a shawl. She didn't hear him at first. The gate creaked softly on its hinges, and when she looked up, Samuel Blossom stood just beyond the garden fence. He carried a small leather satchel and a cluster of pressed papers under one arm. "Good afternoon, Miss Hale," he said, his voice warm but quiet. "Good afternoon," Meg replied, rising to her feet and brushing soil from her apron. "I hope I'm not intruding," he added. "I was walking down from the hill and saw the lavender. It's thriving." Meg glanced back at the neat rows. "Yes, I suppose it is, though I still feel like I'm guessing at half of what I do." He smiled faintly. "You're doing more than guessing. Plants can sense a steady hand." She opened the gate slightly, inviting him into the small garden. As he stepped inside, Meg noticed how easily he carried himself, calm, assured, but not overbearing. His eyes drifted to the herb beds. "You've got lemon balm there, I see. And your thyme looks strong." "I've tried to keep up Martha's garden," Meg said softly, but she seemed to know every plant by heart, every season's peculiarities. "I've only just begun." Samuel crouched beside the thyme, running a careful finger over its tiny fragrant leaves. "My mother used to say tending a garden isn't about knowing everything, it's about paying attention." He looked up at her. "You seem the sort to notice things." Meg felt a faint warmth rise to her cheeks. "I try. Bellewood has a way of teaching you to slow down." "It does," Samuel agreed. "That's why I came back." She tilted her head. "After all your travels, was it strange returning here?" "For a time," he admitted. "But there's a quiet here I didn't find anywhere else. Even the rarest flower loses something in a noisy city." Meg found herself smiling. "I can understand that." There was a pause, not heavy, but companionable. Samuel stood, brushing his hands lightly against his trousers. I'll let you return to your work, Miss Hale, but if you ever want to trade notes on herbs, or if you're curious about the plants I've brought back from abroad, I'll be glad to share. Thank you, Meg said softly. I think I'd like that. As he stepped through the gate and onto the path, Samuel glanced back once, his expression unreadable but kind. Your rosemary's strong, he said. I think you are too. Meg stood in the garden for a long moment after he'd gone, the scent of lavender thick in the warm air, and for the first time in years, she felt a small, steady flicker of curiosity, not about her grief or her work, but about what might come next. That evening, she lit the candle in the apothecary window and whispered into the quiet, perhaps the world is growing larger again. The garden was hushed in the fading light. Meg sat in the worn wooden bench near the rosemary bush, her skirt brushing the warm stone path as she tucked her hands into her lap. The air smelled of lavender and earth, sweet and grounding, all at once. It had been a long day at the shop. Mrs. Renshaw had lingered over her peppermint tea, recounting old family tales. A young mother came seeking chamomile for her restless baby, and the carpenter's wife stopped in for a calendula ointment, leaving behind a small basket of sugared plums in thanks. Meg felt tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the ache of hands that had worked steadily and a heart that was beginning to mend. She looked down at her palms. There were still faint green stains from trimming the thyme and the soft scratch across her knuckle from the rosemary's thorns. Once, her hands had trembled with every small task. Now they moved with quiet purpose, as though they'd begun to remember their strength. Her thoughts drifted, inevitably, to Samuel Blossom. She hadn't expected to see him today, but there he was at the garden gate, his satchel slung over one shoulder, his steady gaze soft but alert, like a man who had learned to watch the world closely. She remembered the way he had crouched beside the thyme, fingers brushing the leaves with reverence, and his words as he left still echoed faintly in her chest. Your rosemary's strong. I think you are too. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her like that, not as though she were fragile, nor as though her grief defined her, just as Meg. She felt a strange warmth unfurling in her chest, not longing, not yet, really, but a quiet curiosity. She watched the fireflies rise above the garden wall, their faint glow flickering like the tiny lanterns in the dusk. I don't know where this path leads, she murmured to the rosemary bush, but for the first time, the thought didn't fill her with fear. Later, as she lit the candle in the apothecary window, Meg whispered into the quiet, perhaps I'm not done growing. And in the glass, her reflection seemed softer somehow, not quite the woman she'd been, but not the one who arrived. The bell above the apothecary door jingled gently in the late afternoon. Meg looked up from the counter where she'd been carefully measuring dried peppermint into small paper packets, but the doorway was empty. She stepped out from behind the counter, frowning slightly, and then she saw it, a small parcel wrapped in brown paper resting on the shop's worn oak step. Meg bent to pick it up. The parcel was neatly tied with twine, and a folded note rested on top. Her name was written in a strong, careful hand, Miss Hale. She untied the twine slowly, the scent of dried herbs rising faintly from the paper. Inside were several tiny packets, each labeled in Samuel Blossom's distinctive script. Heart's Ease, Viola Tricolor for softening sorrow, Lemon Verbena for calm and clarity, Forage for courage. Beneath the seed packets was a small square of parchment. I thought these might find good soil in your garden. Bellewood air seems to suit them. No hurry to plant them. Like all living things, they'll grow in their own time. S.B. Meg ran her fingers lightly over the paper. The gesture was simple, but it caught her off guard. Not because it was grand or sweeping, but because it felt seen. She had spent so long trying to prove to herself, to Bellewood, that she belonged in the apothecary, and here was someone who seemed to believe it already. That evening, as she stood in the garden with the seed packets cradled in her hands, Meg looked over the herb beds. There was a small, empty corner near the rosemary bush where the soil had been turned and left bare. She knelt and began working the earth gently with her fingers, her hands moving with quiet care. She would plant the heart's ease first, she decided. Her aunt had once told her that it was a flower for healing, good for mending broken hearts and tired spirits. As Meg pressed the seeds into the soil, she felt a faint warmth bloom in her chest, a deep sense of gratitude. That night, she lit the candle in the apothecary window as always. As she always did. But this time, she lingered at the glass for a long moment, watching the hill where Samuel Blossom's house stood against the darkening sky. And she whispered softly to the stillness, "Thank you." The apothecary was still in the early morning light, the faint scent of drying lavender curling through the air like a soft memory. Meg stood at the counter, her fingers carefully folding a square of muslin. Inside lay a handful of lavender blossoms, their color muted, but their fragrance rich and calming. She hadn't planned to make anything for Samuel Blossom, but ever since the seed gift had appeared at her doorstep, she couldn't stop thinking about the quiet thoughtfulness of it, the way he had chosen plants not for show, but for their gentle healing nature, and how his note had carried no expectation, only encouragement. Meg tied the sachet with a piece of pale gray ribbon and held it for a moment in her palms. It felt so strange and tender to be making something not for a customer, not for the shop, but for one person in particular. That afternoon, she walked the narrow path leading to Samuel's house on the hill. The garden around his home was alive with blooms and trailing vines, as though the earth itself had rushed to greet his return. She hesitated at the gate, feeling her heart give an unfamiliar, delicate flutter. The house seemed quiet. A faint breeze stirred the leaves overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a bee hummed lazily through clover. She placed the sachet gently on the gatepost, tucking a small note beneath the ribbon. For restful nights and clear thoughts, from one gardener to another. M.H. Meg lingered for a moment, her fingers resting lightly on the wood. Then she turned and walked back down the path, the warm air carrying the faint scent of rosemary and wild roses. That evening, she stood in her own garden, watching the bees settle into their hives as the sun dipped low. For the first time in years, her chest felt light. Not as though the grief was gone, but as though there was still room now for other feelings, too. When she lit the candle in the apothecary's window, she whispered softly to the flame, "Perhaps some roots take longer to grow, but they grow all the same." The apothecary doorbell jingled softly. Meg looked up from the counter, her fingers still dusted with flour from the grinding dyed calendula petals. And there he was, Samuel Blossom, standing in the doorway, the afternoon sunlight spilling across his shoulders. In his hands, he held a book. "Good afternoon, Miss Hale," he said, his voice warm and steady. "Good afternoon, Mr. Blossom." She tried to keep her tone light, but her heart gave a small, unsteady flutter. I came to thank you, he said, stepping into the shop, for the lavender sachet. I haven't slept so soundly in months. I'm glad, Meg replied softly. He placed the book gently on the counter. I thought you might find this useful. It's a botanical sketchbook I kept during my travels. There are notes on herbs. Some we share with Italy and France. Others I'm hoping to coax into Bellewood soil. Meg ran her fingers lightly over the leather cover. This is very generous. Consider it a trade, Samuel said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, for restful nights. There was a pause, not awkward, but soft. The smell of lavender seemed to linger between them. Meg tilted her head slightly. Do you always keep such careful notes? Always, he said. Plants teach you quickly that every detail matters. His gaze met hers, calm and intent. And people, too. Meg felt a faint warmth rise in her chest. For a moment it was as though the shop itself had grown still, holding its breath. But then the bell above the door jingled again, and Mrs. Renshaw bustled in, arms full of fabric. Samuel gave Meg a small nod. I'll leave you to your customers, Miss Hale, but I hope you'll let me know if any of these seeds take root. As he stepped out into the sunlit square, Meg watched him go, strong and steady. That evening, as she turned the pages of his sketchbook by candlelight, she whispered to the quiet room, perhaps roots aren't the only thing growing here.